Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
It's good to be here.
So imagine two of the biggest intellectual engines of our time just colliding. On one side, you've got the neuroscientist, the famously precise atheist Sam Harris.
Right.
And he's arguing that truth is all about facts, data, scientific reality. But on the other side, you have Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, who believes truth is really found in these ancient stories, the myths that kept our ancestors alive.
And they finally met in Vancouver.
They did, moderated by Bret Weinstein. And it wasn't just a debate, it felt more like a battle over the very definition of God, of truth, and, how we should even live.
It really was. It was a clash between what you could call the hard drive of science and the cultural software of religion.
And that's what we're going to unpack today. What happens when that irresistible force meets the immovable object?
Yeah, and you really have to remember the context here. This was not just some polite academic chat. Bret Weinstein, who was moderating, he framed it almost like a rescue mission.
A rescue mission.
He basically said that our civilizations, our whole sense-making apparatus, so our universities, the media, our institutions, it's all breaking down.
Right.
We're facing these huge existential threats, and we can't even agree on the tools to use to solve them.
So the stakes felt incredibly high. Weinstein wanted to see if they could, I think he said, upgrade our cultural software.
Yeah. Can we merge Harris's reason with Peterson's, let's say, wisdom to stop society from just falling apart?
Well, before we get into all the heavy theology, you have to mention how it started. It set the tone perfectly. Harris proposed a safe word.
Oh, yeah. That was a great moment. The safe word was lobster.
Which, if you know anything about Peterson, is just hilarious.
It's perfect. Peterson is famous for using the nervous systems of lobsters to explain that social hierarchies are, hundreds of millions of years old.
So for Harris to suggest lobster, it was a little friendly jab.
It was, but it also signaled that, things were about to get pretty intense.
And they really did. But what's surprising is that they actually started with agreement. They found a common enemy. Or really, two of them.
They did. Before they started tearing into each other's idea of God, they sort of mapped out the cliffs they were both terrified of falling off of. They agreed. Society is walking on a tightrope.
And on one side of that tightrope, you have what they call the pathology of order.
Which is the fundamentalist cliff, basically. Yeah, religious fundamentalism or any kind of totalitarian dogma. It's a state where the rules are so rigid, so absolute, that new ideas just get crushed. You can't ask questions.
Okay, and on the other side of that tightrope is the pathology of chaos.
Exactly. Moral relativism, nihilism, the feeling that nothing matters, that there are no real values, and everything's just, subjective opinion.
And they both agree falling off either side of that is catastrophic for civilization.
Total agreement there.
Okay, so they agree on the danger, but this is where the unity pretty much ends, right? Because when they start diagnosing why those dangers exist, they're on completely different planets.
Oh, completely. Harris looks at that pathology of order fundamentalism, and he points his finger directly at religion itself.
The source code.
The source code. He says the problem isn't just that people are rigid. The problem is the book they're reading. He talks about the danger of uneditable books.
Meaning the Bible, the Quran.
Exactly. Harris's argument is very, very logical. He says if you believe a book was written by the creator of the universe, you can't edit it. You can't just release version 2.0.
Right.
So if the book says cut off the hand of the thief or you can keep slaves, you are stuck with that bad idea forever. For Harris, religion's like a unique poison because it puts a divine seal of approval on bad ideas and makes them impossible to fix.
But Peterson just wasn't buying that. He doesn't think the book is the problem.
Not at all. Peterson says the problem isn't religion, the problem is dogma. And he makes this crucial point that dogma is a human universal. It's not just a religious thing. He points to the secular regimes of the 20th century.
Stalinism, Maoism.
Right. These were explicitly atheist systems. They didn't have a Bible, but they still resulted in the deaths of millions of people.
So for Peterson, you don't need a god to create a hell on earth. You just need an ideology you can't question.
Exactly. He even takes it all the way back to biology. He brought up Jane Goodall and the chimpanzees at Gombe, how she observed chimps forming these patrols and just brutally tearing outsiders to pieces.
Okay.
And Peterson's argument is, look, those chimps aren't reading Deuteronomy. That kind of tribal aggression is hardwired into our primate ancestry. Religion isn't the cause of that violence. If anything, religion is this messy, evolved attempt to contain it.
Wow. Okay, that is a crucial distinction. So Harris sees religion as the virus.
Yep.
And Peterson sees it as maybe a flawed immune system, but it's the immune system trying to fight the virus of our own nature.
That's a great way to put it.
And this, of course, led them straight into the debate about morality. If we don't use the Bible, where do our values come from? And Harris thinks, well, we can get them from facts.
This is his whole moral landscape argument. Harris is what you'd call a moral realist. He believes moral truths are as objective as, say, mathematical truths.
He used that hell analogy, which I found it really sticks with you. He asks you to imagine the worst possible misery for everyone.
Right. Just picture a universe where every single conscious being is suffering the maximum amount of pain possible for as long as possible. And Harris just says, I don't need a Bible to tell me that's bad.
Yeah.
If the word bad means anything at all, it means that.
And if we agree on that maximal misery is bad, then moving away from it is good, it seems. It seems like a slam dunk. We can just build a whole morality on avoiding suffering.
It sounds incredibly intuitive. Harris says we don't need a myth to know that putting your hand on a hot stove is a bad idea. We just know it. And he thinks we could scale that up to all of society using science and reason.
But Peterson sees a trap there.
He really does. Peterson's argument is that facts on their own are silent. A fact doesn't tell you what to do with it. I mean, there are a million facts in the room with you right now. The temperature, the dust mites, the light. You ignore almost all of them.
You only pay attention to what matters for your goal.
Exactly. And Peterson argues you need an a priori structure, a narrative, a value system to even decide what bad is in the first place.
So when Harris says misery is bad, Peterson thinks Harris is actually borrowing a religious concept without realizing it.
Yes, that's his critique. He argues that Harris is basically smuggling in Judeo-Christian values, slapping a science label on them, and then pretending he just found them under a microscope. Peterson says the moment you identify a hell to run away from and a heaven to run toward, you are operating inside a mythological framework, whether you admit it or not.
And this huge philosophical disagreement got really practical really fast when they started talking about the Bible itself. Harris was just relentless about the barbaric parts of Scripture.
Harris is a literalist in the most brutal sense. He looks at Leviticus, at Deuteronomy, the laws about stoning women who aren't virgins on their wedding night, or how to treat slaves. And he just says, look, the text says what it says.
He even defended the fundamentalists in a weird way, didn't he?
He did. It's a fascinating move. He argued that the fundamentalists are the only ones reading the book, honestly. If the text says sacrifice a goat, they believe it means a goat.
Right.
He thinks the moderate religious people, the ones who say, oh, well, that's just a metaphor for spiritual cleansing, are doing these crazy mental gymnastics to cover for a bad book.
And Peterson's defense was, well, it was definitely not a Sunday school defense.
No, it was a literary and psychological defense.
Yeah.
Peterson argues the Bible isn't a rule book, it's a library. It's a developmental narrative. He used that analogy from storytelling, Chekhov's gun.
Right. Remind us what that is.
It's the idea that if a playwright puts a loaded rifle on the table in Act 1, it has to go off by Act 3. Peterson says you can't just pull one violent verse out of the Bible, that's the rifle, and judge it in isolation.
You'd have to read the whole story.
You have to read the whole library to see how that story resolves.
Yeah.
He claims the Bible is this long dialogue where what he calls the prophetic tradition eventually critiques and updates the dogmatic tradition.
But Harris had such a great comeback for that. He called it playing tennis without a net.
That was a really stinging critique. What Harris is saying is, Jordan, if you can interpret kill the non-believers to mean you should kill your own bad habits, then words have lost all meaning.
Right. If you can just twist the text to mean whatever modern ethics you already hold,
then the text isn't guiding you at all. You are just rewriting the text in your head. And for Harris, that makes the whole exercise of religion totally pointless. Why not just stick with the modern ethics and ditch the confusing ancient book?
And this leads us to what was, for me, the absolute peak of the pension, the God question. Harris finally just pins Peterson down and asks, essentially, who are you talking to when you pray? He demanded a definition.
That was the moment. Harris asked, what is the God you act as though he exists? And Peterson did not give a simple answer. He actually pulled out a prepared list.
I remember that list. It was not God as the creator of the heavens and the earth. It was highly technical.
It was. He said things like, God is how we imaginatively represent consciousness across time. But the one that really stopped the show was when he said God is the mechanism of sexual selection.
Wait, hold on. We have to deep dive on that for a second. How on earth does God equal sexual selection?
Okay, so it's pure evolutionary psychology. Peterson's argument is that for millions of years, Men have arranged themselves into hierarchies of competence. Men compete to be useful, brave, truthful.
Okay, that's standard biology.
Right. And women, historically, select mates from the top of that hierarchy. They select the best men. But Peterson says over deep time, we stop seeing just the individual men and we start abstracting the traits that make them successful. We start to worship the ideal, the hero, the truth teller, the protector. And that abstract ideal, that set of behaviors that leads to survival and reproduction, that, he says, is what we call God.
So God isn't a person in the sky. God is the pattern of behavior that makes men attractive to women across eons.
That's the argument.
That is wild. I mean, it's fascinating, but that is definitely not what my grandmother is thinking about when she goes to church.
And that was exactly Harris's point. He immediately called it a bait and switch. He compared it to Deepak Chopra.
Oh, with the quantum mechanics thing.
Exactly. Harris says it's like when Chopra uses a real scientific term like quantum mechanics to explain why healing crystals work. He's using credible language to prop up superstition.
Right.
And Harris argued that when people pray, they aren't praying to the mechanism of sexual selection. They're praying to a person who can hear them. He thinks Peterson is redefining God into something so abstract that it's basically atheist compatible just to defend traditional religion.
It felt like Harris was just saying, stop playing word games. Does the guy in the sky exist or not?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Harris is demanding clarity. Peterson is demanding depth.
And this clash between clarity and depth, it showed up in the most unexpected debate of the entire night. Masturbation.
Yeah. It sounds ridiculous, but this is actually the key to their whole disagreement about heuristics.
And a heuristic is like a mental shortcut, right?
Yeah, a rule of thumb that helps you survive, even if it isn't technically, literally true. Peterson argued that a religious story like God is watching you historically prevented sexual neurosis.
Okay.
Specifically about masturbation, he argued that the fear of God encouraged young men to stop looking inward for gratification and instead, go out, get married, and procreate.
So the argument is, the story, God hates this, might be a lie, but the result, more families, more babies, was an evolutionary success.
Exactly. Peterson is a pragmatist. For him, truth is what works. If a lie helps you survive and reproduce better than the literal truth, then that lie has a kind of Darwinian truth to it.
But Harris, as a scientist, just hates that.
Oh, he despises it. Harris's counter is that we have better tools now. We're not in the Bronze Age anymore. We have sociology, psychology, sex education. We don't need to terrify teenagers with a surveillance god to teach them about healthy sexuality.
We can just explain the data.
We can just explain the data. Harris wants to strip away all the useful lies and just operate on raw reason.
And this same logic applied to prayer, too. Peterson gave this very psychological description of prayer. He said, sit on your bed, admit you're wrong, and ask, how can I fix this?
And he said if you do that, you will get an answer. It'll bubble up from your subconscious.
And what's amazing is Harris actually agreed with that.
He did, completely. Harris is a huge proponent of meditation. He knows the mind can correct itself. But, and this is the absolute key, Harris insists that when you get that answer, you are talking to yourself.
Right.
You're accessing your own wisdom. You are not downloading instructions from the cosmos. He thinks adding the God label to that psychological process is just unnecessary baggage.
So Harris wants the function, the self-reflection, without the fiction of God.
Yes.
And Peterson thinks the fiction is the container that holds the function. If you break the container, the whole thing just spills out.
That is the perfect way to put it. Peterson worries that if we debug humanity by deleting the God concept, we won't all become rational scientists. We'll just end up possessed by new and probably worse ideas. He thinks the software of religion, as buggy as it is the only thing keeping the hardware from crashing.
And in the final moments, Harris went for the kill shot. He asked the ultimate litmus test question about the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, this was the final showdown. Harris asked, did Jesus literally rise from the dead? Did the body come back to life? He wanted a biological yes or no answer.
And Peterson famously gave a 40-hour answer.
He did. He said, it would take me 40 hours to answer that.
Which just drove Harris up the wall. He said, well, I can answer in a second. Almost certainly not.
And that just highlights the impasse perfectly. For Harris, the resurrection is a claim about biology and physics. Either the cells regenerated or they didn't. It's a binary question.
True or false?
For Peterson, the resurrection is this metaphysical claim about the triumph of the spirit, the redemption of the hero, the very structure of reality itself. He literally cannot answer yes or no because he thinks the question is framed completely wrong.
So you have Harris speaking the language of C++ code. Is it true or false? And you have Peterson speaking the language of Shakespeare or Jung. What does it mean?
And the audience is just left sitting there trying to figure out which language actually drives the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're really left with this massive, unresolved question. I mean, these two men both want to save the world from chaos, but they have completely different maps to get there.
And it really comes down to this.
Hmm?
Can we have a religion, so to speak, that's based entirely on scientific truth?
That's the challenge Harris is putting out there. Can you build a moral life, a community, a sense of purpose just on facts? Or is Peterson right? Is the human brain just hardwired to need a story? Do we need the father, the judge, the savior archetypes to function, even if we know they aren't literally up in the clouds?
If Peterson is right, deleting God is a form of suicide. If Harris is right, keeping God is holding humanity back from growing up.
And that is a question you have to answer for yourself. Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Until next time.